Good morning. My name is Owen McGrath. I work for the EBMT. I'm based in Barcelona in Spain. And I'm going to talk about JACIE standards and accreditation, but also regulations, and try and give you an overview of laws, guidelines, regulations, and standards that affect our sector. I've been working with the EBMT since 2002, specifically on the JACIE accreditation program, and I'm the operations manager. So I'm going to try and paint a picture, give you some idea of context of why we need regulations. We heard just now that we've talked about a technology which is 60 years old, but at the same time there are some very exciting new developments happening. And then the regulatory framework, and then I'll finish with some time dedicated to the standards and accreditation. Just to say that your commissioner, I think he's the only Lithuanian commissioner, happens to be for public health, and he's in my country today while I'm in his country. But this guy is quite key in terms of regulation, at least in the European Union, and he's the head of a commission in Brussels, which we have quite good dialogue with as well. And partly I think it's because he would support a lot of what we are saying today here. So why do we need standards and regulation? So if we think of perhaps this university hospital, and we have a nice organigram and hierarchy, and it's very clear what's going on from the top down to the bottom. But every day, your jobs probably look more like this, and particularly in cellular therapy, where you have a lot of interaction, a lot of people are involved. You have, obviously, staff, your pharmacy department, you might have social workers. Clearly, the patient is there as well, nurses, physicians in training, families, the cleaning staff, dietary staff, etc. And when we come down specifically to bone marrow transplantation, you can see we have donors involved. We have testing for infectious diseases, recovering cells from storage afterwards, the processing, distribution, and all of this surrounding what we're calling the therapeutic application of cells, whether it is 60-year-old technology or much more recent technology. And perhaps one almost unique aspect of cell therapy is the role of the unrelated donor. And this is a paper from 2004, and they calculated that every day 33 stem cell products are being transported. And I would say that since 2014, that number has probably increased. So somebody can calculate how many products are traveling every hour. It's at least one, and a little bit more in a 24-hour period. So also our technology has changed over 60 years. What we did 60 years ago, or even what we did 10 years ago in transplantation, we are doing it differently and better, I would say, now. So apart from this growing increase in the number of unrelated donors, and you can see that from any of the worldwide, from the WMDA, sorry, not WBMT, WMDA, World Marrow Donor Association, you can see that data. But also we're seeing much older patients, and we're now transplanting patients that, again, a short time ago were out of any possibility for transplant. And that's because we can decrease toxicity, but this still needs to, further work. And then in general, your patients, your donors, and you as professionals are demanding higher standards of safety, higher standards of quality as well in what you're doing. So all of this complexity in general, in medicine in general, generates higher possibility of things going wrong. This is a report from the European Parliament, 2015, and you can see that almost 1 in 10 people who went into a European Union hospital suffered some sort of adverse reaction, something they didn't have before they came into the hospital. And then if we drill down a little bit and we just look for headlines from the press, and this is not so much the specialized press, but the popular press, we can see mix-ups, people have been given the wrong medication. We can see that freezing protocols have been identified with failure to engraftment and ultimately death. This is something that we will see every day. And we possibly will see more, not because we're making more mistakes, but people are finding out about them much more quickly than before. As you know, the European Commission, in the context of the directives on tissues and cells, they publish a report each year. This is the 2015 report of severe or serious adverse events and reactions for tissues and cells. And you can see, let me see. Down here for HPC specifically, 38% of all of the reported reactions for tissues and cells were related to hematopoietic stem cells. 42 then broke down between transmitted infections, just 5 cases, and then other SARs, but not specified. And my own thoughts that only 42 for 1 year of activity in the European Union in all areas of, well, in stem cell transplantation, for me, looks like a very small number. And I think if you ask anybody about these reports, they would agree that incidents are underreported, that we are seeing less things happening or going wrong in the report than is actually happening. And you're probably all thinking about something you saw last Thursday or saw 2 weeks ago, which wasn't exactly the right way to go. A lot of ethical issues as well. We have, at least in the context of allogeneic, you have potential conflict between the patient's interest and the donor's interest. You have potential risk for the donor to go through a donation process with growth factors, etc. You have the ethical issue of whether somebody should really go through transplant. Is transplant really the best option for this person? Or because we're transplanters, we're going to transplant everybody as much as we can? We have a gap between supply, which is, if you like, donors, and demand, which is the need for therapies and treatments. We have each individual's personal ethical values, beliefs, and religiosity as well. Conflict of interest in general could be the physician, it could be the family, etc. And this becomes particularly pronounced when we talk about consent, and particularly when we're talking about kids or minors being consented either as patients or as donors. One example is in the context of a patient or a donor is where the need to do a pregnancy assessment if the child is of childbearing age. And I can tell you that in some cultures that this is a very, very, very difficult issue to raise with the parents and to explain why as part of the workup they need to, or before workup rather, of the donor, they need to ensure that somebody is not pregnant. And that's an issue which in some countries, I'm thinking of the Middle East, can present severe difficulties to manage. And then perhaps widening the focus from purely our classic bone marrow transplantation, but this is also relevant, that there is and always has been a commitment to the non-commercialization or the non-commodification of the human body. We normally think of this in terms of solid organs. Obviously there's the trade in organs, there are donors being paid in some countries, etc. But it's equally or potentially applicable to our sector as well. Data protection. We can see what happened last week with the WannaCry virus, where with the quantity of data, of personal data, and increasingly amounts of medical data, which is now in digital format, how that confidentiality has to be protected. And then the concept of the voluntary unpaid donation as well. It's a very, very hot issue and always has been in blood transfusion. But again, there's an aspect which affects our sector as well. And then going back to what we heard about the future developments, and that's one of the topics for today as well, future directions. And CAR T cells, for instance. CAR T cells are fantastic, but we all know as well about the toxicity can be very high as well. So safety is one of the key aspects of this. We know of the trials where several patients in some of the high-profile trials have not made it. They have actually died. So I, as a patient, want some guarantees and to be convinced that this is the best option for me at a given moment. And then the production as well. And the production in those therapies is complex. The logistics are complex. So as I said before, complexity increases the possibilities of something going wrong. We're going to find ourselves as academics, most of us I think here are working in the academic sector, of forming partnerships with industry, partnerships which will be new in many cases. There will be perhaps a new language, a new methodology in those partnerships, those agreements, in order to actually take what the academics are doing in the laboratory, taking that research and bringing it to the bedside in a way that satisfies the patient's needs, satisfies industry's needs as well, and satisfies Ministry of Health needs and whoever pays for these treatments too. Associations are key. So we do see strong patient associations who are keen as well to contribute. Here, I just say that these last couple of slides come from a woman in France, Rial Sebag, who presented at our EBMT conference 2 years ago, or last year, beg your pardon. And she highlighted the role of the AFM in France in terms of contributing to production. And then all of this needs to be encapsulated in a legal perspective or a framework, and taking into account all of these interests that I've mentioned. The EU CELEX project, which Ms. Rial Sebag was leading, is now finished, but there are results of the project, which was sponsored by the European Union, I'm pretty sure are still available on their website, and I would encourage you to have a look, because it does lift our gaze. It does open up, if you like, our perspective from the purely scientific and medical to the issues that I've included in the previous slides. So given this context of complexity, this context of high risk, we were talking about transplant-related mortality, which can be up to 40% in some indications. But in general in healthcare, there was a response. People realized that something needed to be done. So this is a list of popular improvement strategies in general medicine. It's not just stem cell. And many of them you recognize. I'm going to highlight just two here. One is teamwork and collaboration as a strategy. And the second is external accreditation and standards. Okay? And then we're going to look a little bit at those. So teamwork, again, I'll emphasize that aspect I made at the start and those graphs of the crazy arrows and the connections and this idea of many hands. So a lot of people are involved in delivering care. But we are moving, I think, from the classic hierarchical model of the top professor and everybody is below this professor and then there's everybody below the doctor and etc. And that structures are changing and becoming more horizontal. And that the need for multidisciplinary teams to deliver care, if it was ever in doubt, is complete. I don't think anybody could argue against them now. So that's a phenomenon which is general, but I'm sure we can all recognize it in our own work. And then, why do we work in teams? So this is some data where it says that most quality and safety problems are interprofessional in origin, and that 70% of medical errors are due to poor teamwork and communication. So again, we can see in our programs, we can see in our structures the gaps where information falls down, where patients drop into and are neither under the care of one team or another part, or etc. So this seems very simple, and in theory it's quite simple to fix as well. Close those gaps, improve communication. And then it's considered proven as well that high-functioning teams have greater quality improvement success as well. So then moving on to accreditation as a strategy. This is a nice table because it lines up regulation and it puts regulation alongside accreditation. So whether regulation tends to be minimal safeguards, minimal standards, accreditation tends to be optimal. The aim of regulation is that you have to comply in the same way as any law, whereas accreditation should be aimed at development. It should be aimed at something being continuous. Facilitation. I don't think there are too many ministries of health or regulatory agencies which facilitate the path of a caring institution through the regulatory pathway. Accreditation, the philosophy is usually far more supportive and far more aimed at facilitating the applicant. There's almost always in regulations, it is difficult to know exactly what will be looked at. There is usually no checklist, at least a public checklist. You have the law, but you don't know exactly how the inspectors or the auditors will go through the process. With accreditation, that checklist is generally public. You see it in advance, you use it to prepare, etc. The assessors are rarely experts in the field they're inspecting. They are experts, but usually they have such a broad mission that today they're looking at bone marrow transplantation, tomorrow they're looking at a bone bank, next week they have an eye bank. So there are very few experts who are experts in all of these areas. On the other hand, accreditation is performed by peers, by people who are dedicated to this area and who usually voluntarily give some of their time to helping with accreditation. And then finally, the level of staff engagement with regulation, with the police, if you like, it tends to be lower than with an accreditation pathway. So if you like, when accreditation has gone through, maybe, in fact, accreditation as a concept in health is around 100 years old. It started in, I think it was 1918 in the United States with Joint Commission. But it's quite simple as well. It's, let's fix the obvious. Let's get the basic things working correctly. The next step then is, once that is achieved, then we start to systemize processes and standardize procedures. This is the idea that no matter who is delivering a particular process, no matter who is caring for a patient, if they are all following standardized processes, the patient will receive the same care. Okay? This is different from before, that you were hoping that you got Dr. Bob, because Dr. Bob, everybody says he's great, and everybody says that Dr. Jim is not such a great doctor. In this scenario of standardization, Bob and Jim will give you the same care. And then perfection. Perfection is never achieved, but you are always aiming for perfection. So you're on this pathway of continuous improvement. So to focus far more closely on our sector, which is in bone marrow transplantation, what happened in bone marrow transplantation? So there are guidelines. This is from the Council of Europe. This is, I think, the second edition. The third edition, I think, is about to come out very, very shortly. It's free, it's PDF, and it's a very accessible guide written for a very, very wide public as well, but I would highly recommend it. There are WHO guidelines on safe and effective cells and tissues for transplantation, so a minimum set of requirements that should be in place. In terms of regulations, this is a list of countries whose regulations that I've seen or I've read or I'm familiar with, and you can see that we are talking about a global phenomenon from South America, European Union, North America rather, Middle East, Far East, etc., Australia. But one thing which is clear as well, that the existence of a regulation or a law does not mean that anybody is actually following this regulation or law. So again, we know from, I'll give the example of solid organ transplantation in Pakistan. they have regulations which prohibit a lot of what we see, but clearly it's not working. There's no supervision or there's no vigilance of much of what is going on, in spite of what the law says. European Union is, and you'll all know this, is an area which is highly regulated, at least, we'll say, most of our process. So starting with the directives in 2004 and working all the way down to the most recent ones in 2015, anything around cell collection and cell processing falls under these directives, okay? And apart from the regulation, the European Union doesn't want to be another set of laws which nobody follows. There have been concerted efforts over the last probably 15 years of projects and joint actions which support the regulations and the legislation. Okay, so they have and continue to do projects which aim to either build the capacity of the professionals who are delivering care, or to build the capacity of the competent authorities in each member state to make sure that what is being done is correct and is following the regulations. So then we're also living in a framework which is managing or regulating the what I call non-classic bone marrow transplantation. So this is where we talk about these advanced therapies, these new applications of old technology of cellular therapy. Under the European Union, these are ATMPs, Advanced Therapeutic Medicinal Products. There is already the Medicinal Products Directive, but probably the most significant one was 2007, which specifically regulated advanced therapies. I've heard one speaker say that in 2007 it was a very advanced directive. In a very competitive, globalized world, the European Union was conscious that it was developing regulations to allow European biotechnology and pharma to compete with Japanese, with Korean, with the United States, etc. However, it's been a very challenging area. Under the regulation, I think it's only 4 or 5 cell-based TMP products have been authorized, and of those, I think 4 have been withdrawn from market because they couldn't, nobody could afford them. Nobody could actually pay for the actual products. Last year, I think 2 more have been approved, and we'll see if they have more success. But apart from that, and you'll see this in different publications, and I've heard it at different conferences, but it's been problematic because there is occasion where there is overlap between the European directives on tissues and cells and the advanced therapies regulation as well. And this is when it comes down to definitions. What is an advanced therapy? What is a substantial manipulation of a cell-based product, etc.? And one of the main topics for debate is the use of what we call a hospital exemption. Hospital exemption is for a product which is directed to an individual. It really is where a product is not being developed for commercial purposes. And how this is regulated is very, very different depending on which country you're in. So we don't have a homogeneous interpretation and implementation of this. So that's just one aspect of a complex area which is still, I think, in a phase of evolution. And hopefully it will come to a point which is more satisfactory for patients, for academia, for industry, and also for the payers, the public healthcare systems as well. EBMT and JACIE, which is the part of the EBMT I work for, we're very, very conscious of the need to engage with the European Union and with regulators. So we do have a good channel open with the Commission, which I mentioned earlier as well. We do respond to invitations to participate in those projects as well. And with the Medicines Agency as well, in the last 2 years, we've certainly attempted to engage and to talk to them. And we're doing that not on behalf of an office in Barcelona. We're doing that on behalf of professionals, whether you're working in Lithuania, in Germany, Spain, Ireland, or wherever within the European Union. So this is, if you like, the EBMT as a professional society assuming a role as representing interests of the professionals, but also I think we're also keen to represent the interests of patients in terms of access to these therapies, so that it's probably quite likely that in the next 12 to 18 months, European Medicines Agency will follow the FDA. We'll see Novartis, Kite, Bluebird, etc., achieving authorization for their products, and we'll see them reaching hospital bedside, if you like. But one aspect is cost. One very significant aspect is cost. More detail on this you can see on the JACIE website, jacie.org, and under national regulations. And then that brings me to standards, okay? So, while regulations were being designed, while guidelines were being drafted by various bodies like the European Union, like the FDA, like WHO, the sector itself, through the professional associations, was also reacting or responding to this complexity and to this risk as well. So this table is taken from a publication from this year, actually. It's under transfusion medicine, but they dedicated an interesting chapter on regulation and accreditation in cellular therapy. And I have copied from their publication this, what I think is a nice graph, showing all of the professional society initiatives covering all aspects of transplantation, from histocompatibility, the registry with the WMDA, FACT and JACIE, who we developed the same standards, also AABB, which is principally US, but also international, covering collection center, cord blood bank, apheresis, marrow, cord blood, cell processing laboratory, the transplant center itself. Then we come down to regulations as well, European Union, FDA. So it's a heavily standardized field of medicine, I would say. And I would also say successfully standardized as well. In the United States, I'd say they pioneered it when a very high-profile case happened in Boston in the Dana-Farber Center, mid-90s, which really just confirmed for many observers the need to start developing standards. So that's mid-90s. Very shortly afterwards in Europe, some of we'll call them some very key people working within the European Society, the EBMT, observed what was happening in Europe and saw the necessity to bring the concept to Europe and to encourage and to try and get engagement from the European transplanters as well. And one key aspect was this view, which, if you like, compared to regulation, which tends to look at each part in isolation, if you like, a silo view of, over here is the clinical unit, collection unit, processing, but with no consideration of the interaction. The FACT JACIE view, and indeed of I would say all of the other standards organizations, is that this has to be looked at as a joined up set of services, a set of facilities, of professionals, in order to really make sure that we're delivering good care. And consequently, the standards, you will see that many of the aspects are in the same color, which really is to stress the commonality in many areas. And just to highlight as well that you will see quality management policies and procedures repeated across all of the areas here. Then some more specific aspects, donor management falls into clinical and into collection as well. Labeling, quite technical in some aspects, but very, very comprehensive, and as I say, covering all the entire process. The standards are international. They're written as a consensus by, I would say there's probably about 21 countries represented across the subcommittees. They're renewed every 3 years, so they respond quite quickly to any developments in the medicine or in the science. They complement regulations. They don't attempt to replace regulations. And they are driven by consensus. And just to highlight, about 3 weeks ago, we opened the public consultation on the new edition of the standards, which will be published in March 2018. As individuals who will probably be affected sooner or later by the standards, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at the proposed standards, and ideally to come back and give feedback, including saying, we think this is impossible, okay? So that public consultation is very, very important. And also just to stress, as an example of how we reflect changes, the new standards, the 6th edition, includes administration of what we're calling immune effector cells, which includes CAR-Ts. So there are standards which control or which regulate the administration of these new products with the potential for severe adverse reactions, toxicity, etc., that these cells will include. So we are expecting in the next couple of years to start to find these products being delivered in transplant units. We know it's happening already in transplant units under clinical trials, and we'll see that, I think, develop quite soon. So through standardization and through this, what are we actually looking for? What do we want? Well, principally, we want to improve patient survival and patient outcome, okay? So without this being a mission or an objective, it is a purely bureaucratic exercise, okay? It becomes an exercise just to get a piece of paper which says you are accredited. But if the exercise is aimed at improving how you're organized, if the exercise is aimed at generating the highest possibilities for a positive outcome for your patient, then the focus changes, then the motivation should change as well. And the enthusiasm for what can be a very dry process should change too. Unfortunately, JACIE is JACIE accreditation, but quality management is one of the probably pioneering disciplines, or transplantation is one of the pioneering disciplines where there is evidence of an effect of quality management on clinical outcome. So I'll just direct you to a paper from 2014 led by Professor Alois Grabwall from Basel, using the EBMT registry, which you probably know has now over 500,000 transplants have been entered into the registry, and using that as a retrospective study, was able to find that while everybody in transplantation was getting better over the years, there is an effect for centers through days like today, education, training, exchanges, etc. We know we're transplanting better in general. But what we could observe was that a center or centers who have engaged with quality and have gone through a series of steps from preparing through an inspection, through achieving accreditation, that they're doing even better. The difference being that if you don't have any accreditation, you're improving by 3.5% per year. JACIE is improving by almost 2 percentage points above that. So the number of percentage points is small, but the number of patients that affects is quite significant. And then in JACIE accredited centers, we're seeing higher relapse-free and overall survival at 72 months compared to the rest of the centers as well. Within this, you have lack of reporting, perhaps you have lack of follow-up. Well, one thing which we've also seen is that follow-up is improved through going through accreditation as well. So this is among the few real examples of scientific data showing a strong correlation between quality and improvement for your patient as well. And I'm very happy to say that we see an improvement for how we manage our donors as well. This is the first of 2 papers from, I think, 2 years ago. One was just a single center, but the follow-up paper is a much wider sample. And we are managing our related donors in a much better way by applying the standards, the FACT-JACIE standards. So we are managing, through using the standards, some of the ethical issues that I showed in the slide earlier on. for instance, that the donors are being managed by somebody who is not responsible for the recipient, that physician, his or her priority is normally his patient, and that may affect how he or she assesses and how he or she consents or facilitates the donor as well. Particularly in a family context, we know that that's more complex, and there may be aspects there which could go against the interest of the donor in those cases. We don't just want to be an exercise that increases costs. This is from 2004. This is an editorial in bone marrow transplantation at a time when JACIE was really just starting. We were just in our first couple of years of activity. And it's worth reading this editorial. I'm pretty sure it's now open access. I have to say that the conclusion of the piece is far more positive than the headline itself, but it's certainly worth reading again actually now, 13 or 14 years later, to see if what Jane Apperly at the time wrote, if it's still actually true. And we don't want to be this bureaucratic exercise where people just tick boxes. And we certainly do not want that as experts, as physicians, as nurses, as technicians, as scientists, that you stop thinking, that you only do what's written down. That's not the objective. What we want is that what you do, your ideas, your initiatives, your discoveries happen within a context of control and within a context of quality management and quality improvement as well. And outcomes in this cartoon, outcomes is something that is becoming more and more important as we improve how we measure outcome, but it should not be just based here, as they say, on how high the paper is in the office. It should be something a little bit more scientific and more relevant as well. So just talking about JACIE today, I'm obviously biased. My conflict of interest is that I'm 15 years with JACIE, but I think it's one of the, I would say with the EBMT registry, JACIE and accreditation has been one of the two key success stories of EBMT over the last 40 years. You can see that we are not an issue, something that is just UK, or it's not just something that happens in Germany, but we have a phenomenon which crosses borders, which has, I would say, created a language, a common language around quality, which certainly didn't exist 15 years ago. If you said to a physician 15 years ago to write a standard operational procedure, perhaps maybe they might have known what you're talking about. But I think now, regardless of where that physician is working, I think that language will sound at least familiar to them, and hopefully more as well. If we look then at how high the take-up as well is, this is based on the 2014 activity survey data from EBMT. You can see that in allogeneic transplantation, I would say that in autologous, the take-up or the penetration is lower, but in allogeneic, we're looking at those dark red countries of where practically all centers in a given country doing allogeneic transplantation have either applied for accreditation, have been inspected, or have achieved accreditation, okay? And you can see how high those numbers are in some countries. But you can also see the geographical distribution as well. And last week I was in Argentina at a Latin American Congress, and we're very, very convinced that that will be the next region. I'll have to get a bigger map to show South America as well, because I think we will start to see centers applying from there as well. What I would say is that there's an area in the European Union at least which we have an absence of centers engaged. We understand there are different reasons for this. Historically, I would say it was probably resources, but I think as the years go by, that it perhaps is not the main reason. And I'm very hopeful, though, that in the next couple of years we'll see some more progress in Central Europe as well, and Eastern Europe. And it's not just a voluntary scheme either, that I think very unusually for a profession-driven initiative, JACIE accreditation has been incorporated into some regulations regulations for authorizing transplantation, which is the case in the Netherlands, where you cannot transplant unless you have accreditation. That's since 2006, that's 11 years ago. Belgium is similar. France for authorization, Italy is similar as well. And also in the UK and Switzerland, and I think Belgium, they've also associated accreditation with the hospital receiving repayment or reimbursement of treatment costs as well. And in fact, where there is money, there is motivation. So this has been one of the key drivers as well. And then in Spain, in a slightly different color, it's not quite, it's not a regulation, but it's a very, very strong endorsement from the National Transplant Organization and strong encouragement of Spanish transplant centers as well. And I'll just show you this, if you like, as a way to reflect on everything we've seen. And this is from 1962. It's a book called Diffusion of Innovations. And it talks about these phases: the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. For laggards, if you don't understand the term, is somebody who is very, very slow to follow a trend or to follow an initiative. So laggards will be slow. And you could talk about this in the context of smartphones. You could talk about this probably in the context of the wheel, going back, I don't know how many millions of years ago. But I've adapted this a little bit to JACIE, where over, if you like, 2004, when we had some European Union funding and we really kicked off JACIE and we did our first 20 inspections, up to now, or recently 2016, and this, I think, is where we are. I think we're approaching the top of the curve, where we will have, certainly we have the innovators, those pioneering centers, or brave centers at the start, the early adopters, the early majority, and now we're reaching this point where the centers who are left will be the late majority, and potentially we might reach the laggards, we might not. I don't think we'll ever get 100%. But there will always be some who will just never engage with this. So this period here is going to be interesting, because in some ways it could be the hardest part. It could be really reaching those centers who simply were not ready for this first part and still have problems. But we're anxious to find out how we can help them. And one way we're looking at it is by making the accreditation process into steps, rather than being one process with all of the standards and everything in one go. We're looking at a process for those centers who are challenged in resource terms, principally. For instance, South America could be one region, that we can help them also engage with this process as well. I'm going to close with the last couple of slides just to highlight the role of the inspectors. An inspector is an individual who 365 or 360 days of the year is a cell therapy expert who works in a hospital, who is a physician, who is a scientist, but who, for whatever reason, dedicates to us voluntarily 2 or 3 days a year and performs inspections for us. They are people who have at least 5 years professional experience directly in transplantation. They don't get paid. There are no rich inspectors, I have to say that. We try and put you in nice hotels and try and put you on direct flights, but nobody gets wealthy. But they are the key to this process, because the persons who will inspect you will be people like you. The people that you would inspect are people like you as well. So that language is common, that understanding is common. Obviously the viewpoint changes, where you're now trying to observe compliance with standards. And I would say that we would be very happy to have Lithuanian candidates for inspection, or to become inspectors, not least of all because we will, and I've heard the excellent level of English in this room already today, so we would be very happy to send you to inspect in Ireland and UK, and Singapore also speaks English, South Africa speaks English as well, so it is a way to travel a little bit too. Okay, just a thought as well on what you're doing right now and what we're trying to improve as well. This guy Denning, he's a quality guru from post-World War II, and a lot of his principles, which were applied in industry, are still relevant today. And a bad system will beat a good person every time. We're trying through accreditation, through standards, to build good systems, so that even good systems will also make sure that the bad guys do better jobs as well. For more information, there's our website. We have 2 training courses. There is one in June, actually, but I think it may be full, so the next one is in October. That will be principally aimed at people who are interested in being an inspector. But also we're going to hold an event in Warsaw in November as well. These events usually are about 20 to 25 people, so they're excellent opportunities really to interact with the group as well. If anybody is interested in any of this or any aspect of what I said today, just write to jacie@ebamt.org. And I think I can close my presentation and invite you to Barcelona anytime that you're in the region. Thank you.